smoking. This is very addictive. How do we get addicted to it?
Worldwide, there's 1 billion smokers, including perhaps about 100 million in India. What Western tobacco industry or cigarette industry has done is very effectively engineer a completely lethal, addictive product. A typical smoker who starts early and doesn't quit in life can expect to lose about a decade of lost life. They tend to be more overweight, they tend to drink more alcohol, and have other challenges. So if smokers quit before age 30, they basically avoid almost all of the excess 10 years. If they quit by 40, they avoid 9 years of lost life. The tobacco industry, they make about $10,000 of profit for each death.
It's a systematic trap. Then what is happening? Why can't we quit?
People quit smoking in India as not to avoid disease, but as a consequence of disease. Always be careful not to blame smokers, but rather focus on smoking.
Hello everyone, I'm Vikas and you are watching or listening to Run with Fitpage. As you already know, this is our weekly show and we get to speak with someone who's an expert and an interesting speaker in the area of their expertise. And today there is one such topic that is relevant, that's current all the time and requires an urgent attention. That is the issue of smoking. And to address this, we have someone who is an expert in their own field. I'm speaking with Dr. Prabhat Jha. Dr. Jha led 1 million death study, the impact of smoking and the expanse of its impact. I never knew that there are more than 1 million deaths per year due to smoking. I did not know almost every type of cancer, if you're a smoker, you're prone to. I did not know that there are 100 million people in India who smoke. Could you believe that 1 out of every 15% smokes? And the impact of that is so severe that 1 out of every 100 people will die for sure. Let's go through this very interesting conversation, and by the end of it, hopefully you will pledge to quit smoking if you are a smoker, or persuade your near and dear ones to quit smoking if they are. Let's get into this conversation and make it a real impactful one. Dr. Jha, welcome to the show. It's our weekly conversation where we pick up a topic of interest from health and nutrition and fitness point of view and cover more in detail. And today we are discussing prevalent and very important topic, that is smoking. And you are someone who's an authority in this field, and so we are indebted for you to be with us today.
Pleasure to be with you, Vikas.
Thank you. How about we start with an introduction of yours? How did your interest grow in this field, and where are you currently in your field of interest?
So I'm Prabhat Jha. I'm a professor the Nuffield Professor at the University of Oxford, focusing on population health. I'm also the head of department for Oxford Population Health, which is also known as the Nuffield Department of Population Health. And I'm also professor of global health at the University of Toronto, currently on sabbatical for them. So I've been addicted to tobacco control research since really the late 1980s. So after I finished medical school, I came to Oxford to study epidemiology, to do a PhD or a DPhil as it's called. And I focused that research mostly on cervical cancer, but along the way, I started working with Richard Peto, who's an eminent epidemiologist. And in the discussions with him, it was absolutely clear that one of the big global challenges was at that time and continues to be smoking. So just to give you some numbers, and I apologize, epidemiologists want to give lots of numbers, and sometimes we're criticized as being number crunchers like accountants. And that's not fair. Accountants have far more personality than do epidemiologists.
Not true.
But so just to give you some numbers, because this is the way to think about this. So worldwide, there's 1 billion smokers, including perhaps about 100 million in India, maybe a little less now, and about 300 million in China. And that a typical smoker who starts early and doesn't quit in life can expect to lose about a decade of lost life. And that's a decade of life is on average So if you take smokers, not all smokers are killed by their addiction, but those that are lose about 2 decades of life, and those that are not lose none. And so you average them out, and it's about 10 years of lost life for a typical smoker versus a non smoker. And that's taking into account differences. Smokers tend to be poorer, they tend to be more overweight, they tend to drink more alcohol and have other challenges. But you take that into account, and still there's a full decade of lost lives. The third big statistic is that worldwide there's about somewhere between 5 to 7 million deaths a year from smoking, and including about 1 million in India and about 1 million in China per year. And just to put that into context, we all very much understood what was the enormous consequence of the COVID pandemic, which killed roughly perhaps 5 million a year for up to about 3 years. That's the number that routinely die from tobacco attributable conditions worldwide. So it's an enormous problem, but it has enormous solutions, which we can talk about, enormously effective solutions, which we can talk about. And I say those because so many smokers and so much of the public really don't appreciate the huge risks of smoking. It's the single most dangerous activity that adults can do, and enormous risks of smoking are really underappreciated in many, many circles, among individuals, also among decision makers. Because you have this story always that, oh, well, my grandmother smoked or my grandfather smoked and he lived till age 90. People take that individual anecdote and say, well, smoking must be safe. What they don't look at, which is what boring epidemiologists like me do, is we say, well, let's not study just your grandfather, but let's study thousands of grandfathers. And then if you look at thousands of grandfathers and ask, well, how many of them are dead that smoked and how many of them are dead that didn't smoke? And that's where you see an enormous tripling of the risk between otherwise similar smokers and non-smokers. So there's a common misperception because the lag effects are quite long for smoking. If you want to kill yourself from smoking, start early and don't quit. So the enormous risks of smoking are really still underestimated. And I'll add, just before I turn it back to you, that often in the circles that I've seen in India, you see young, educated professionals who actually, they actually will go to the gym and they do others. And they think, oh, okay, well, I just have a few cigarettes a week. And they think there's no harm in that. And I remember, in fact, when we had our paper in the New England Journal announcing the results in India from the million death study, that there was about 1 million smoking deaths. And we had a press conference at the Taj Hotel in Delhi, and all the journalists were in the room, and we're showing these numbers and showing the risks in India. And many of the journalists were shocked. And then they go out for their cigarette break outside and they're covering the story. And they're like, wait a minute, this can't be that bad. This little 10% of Indians. So, but there's a disconnect. So I think this is why really understanding the risks and the benefits of quitting is very much a continuing challenge of tobacco and tobacco control.
Wow. And thank you for providing the context. It just further underlies the prevalence of the issue and how severe it is and how with greatest priority it needs to be tackled one person at a time. Anecdotally, I somehow persuaded my father to quit smoking about 15 years ago. And just when I was driving back for our podcast, I was speaking with my father, and I did not mention of this podcast, but he was talking about his friend he had gone to see. He said, my friend, he had a fracture today, and I was speaking with him, and he said, but at least one thing happened, that he quit smoking too. So I said, oh, wow. But you the reason? He said, do you know, in last 15 years, 5 people have been able to persuade to quit smoking, and by one person. And then he was very passionately talking about what it does to you when you quit. And now, as I come in this conversation, it's become such a catastrophe in India as well as globally. I would have earlier thought that it will not be as prevalent in India because comparatively we are a poorer country, and I would think that we would first prioritize to eat instead of go and buy and engage in a leisure activity, in my opinion, which is a cigarette or a beedi for that matter. But that doesn't seem to be the case. There are more and more people who smoke. And it seems in the start, I remember my childhood days, people used to start smoking out of passion, and it was almost like a fashion statement that if you smoke a cigarette it's cool, and to sound cool the kids started smoking, and within no time they realized now they cannot stop.
How old was your father when he quit?
He's 67 now,
Okay.
and so he quit when he was 52.
Okay. Well, I mean, our evidence suggests that on average, that's given him about 6 years of life back. So if he would have been a typical smoker, like in the epidemiological studies, and kept smoking, odds are that he would, if he was going to lose life, he would lose at least 10 years of life. But by quitting because the hazards are so big, the benefits of quitting are ridiculously large. So if smokers quit before age 30, they basically avoid almost all of the excess 10 years. If they quit by 40, they avoid 9 years of lost life. If they quit by 50, on which like your father did, they avoid 6 years of lost life. And even quitting by 60 means they get 4 years of life. And then you have to trade that off. These are four, I hope in the case of your father, these are good years of life. It's life where you can be active, you can engage with kids or grandkids as may be relevant, and you're still very much a productive member. So now it's interesting you mentioned the smoking observations that you've had. In fact, there's some good news in India is that smoking prevalence has come down, that the numbers of smokers overall has come down. Now, there's some subtleties there. What has happened is BDs have particularly come down and are being replaced by cigarettes. And to come back to your nice observation, you think, well, why is it such a heavy burden in India? It seems like the cigarette in particular is particularly effective at killing Indians in very large numbers. So let me explain what I mean by that. To get a typical tripling of the risk between smokers and non smokers, in the West, you need to have started smoking early in life and you need to be smoking roughly half a pack or a pack a day. But what we found in our studies is that in India, the median age of onset is actually older. They say Indian men don't grow up until they're in their 20s, and this is true even in terms of the age that they start to take up smoking. So in the West, most smokers start before age 18, but in India, up until recently, it was in their 20s. And then the typical amount of cigarettes smoked is very small. They'd say, oh, I just have, maybe one or two a day or maybe four a day. So despite later age of onset and less amount of smoking, the Indian cigarette and the beedi seem uniquely positioned to kill us in ways that is surprising. And one of the reasons we think is going on is particularly the high background rates of vascular disease.
Yeah.
So you would know well, and you've covered it on your podcast, that so many adult Indians have cardiometabolic dysfunction, so they're at risk of
Yeah.
diabetes. That's one possible explanation. The other is very high background rates of respiratory disease. So, and in particular, tuberculosis is
Yeah.
still common as a cause of death. And what we showed in our studies is that smoking is a cause of TB deaths. So the way to think about this is roughly a third of Indians, perhaps more, are infected with the TB bacillus. I am infected. I know because my father got TB as an adult, and all my brothers and my brother and sister and I and my mother were all infected. So we got treated for a year. But I know from testing that I've got TB bacillus. It's sitting in my lungs, and the body's macrophages have kind of locked it away, and that's very common in India. So what happens in those in the subset of those that smoke, the smoking toxic agents basically get rid of the body's surveillance of the TB. So then it becomes active. So we've shown that in our studies that TB is an important cause of deaths from smoking, and that might also help explain why Indian death rates from smoking are particularly high. So just to come back, the big picture, smoking rates have come down, but the smoker non-smoker risks in India are actually going up, probably reflecting the background rates and the fact that among those smokers, those are the ones that have been serious smokers. It's not so much the amount of smoking, but any smoking over a long time period. That's why India has about the same numbers of deaths as China, with a very different smoking pattern, but both about a million deaths because of this unique toxicity of the inhaled cigarette in and bidi in India.
Wow. Yeah, and about 2 years ago, my dad, he started, and I'm staying with the anecdote because I've gone through this situation myself, and he's in a much better health and fitness now than where he was 15 years ago. But 2 years ago, he started complaining about pain in his cuffs when he would walk. And I knew what was coming. And then I persuaded him to come to Mumbai and we got him checked. Not to our surprise, he had a common circulatory issue, pad. And then we had to get him stents on both of his thighs. And now he's able to walk and run. And he was telling me he did a 6 kilometer run today.
Wow.
And but he could not even pick up anything earlier and even walk for half a kilometer. But then when we were going through it, my dad was in negation. He was like, how could it happen because of smoking, which I quit 13 years ago then because it was 2 years ago. And then when the doctors explained to him how it all builds up, it was almost like a revelation. He was like, I could not have ever figured out this could be the reason.
Is he diabetic as well?
Fortunately not.
But if you think about it, the way the arteries that are in our legs or in our heart or in our head, the arteries are all, they work on the idea of being really like smooth pipelines, right? Like you don't want anything when the blood flows interfering with it. But what happens is what smoking does is basically helps break down the wall of those. So imagine that you've like if you've got a pipe at home, and walls of that become a little rusty. Then, as we know in time, what will happen is that basically that pipe will burst because the pressure keeps pushing against that crack. Smoking basically does that. It causes little cracks in the lining of our arteries. And then, particularly if you have some other risk factors like high cholesterol or diabetes, then that just worsens. And the same process happens in our hearts, in our heads, and in our legs. So, but I'm pleased that your father's got some relief of the peripheral arterial disease. But again, it's one of the ways that smoking kills. And if you think about it, well, why should smoking be so bad? But the way it goes into your lungs, when you inhale, it goes into your lungs, and then the metabolites end up, and all of the toxic products, formaldehyde and nitrosamines and lots of other stuff, they end up in your blood, and then they can cause problems in the heart or in the peripheral vessels, or they end up in your kidney and they can cause problems in the kidney. They end up in the bladder. So smoking is a common cause of bladder cancer. And then it basically goes right throughout your body. So now, generally, the good news, and particularly in your father's case, is that certainly, had he continued to smoke, his peripheral arterial disease would have almost certainly been worse, so much so that it's one of the leading causes of amputations because,
Gangrene.
yeah, you get gangrene and you basically need to have the leg amputated is the only way to save it. So he did himself a lot of good by quitting reasonably early.
No, I agree. And I think with that, it also sets right background for us to understand this a bit more in detail right at the base as to why this is happening, even to start with. To my mind, it's just voluntarily we are inviting an issue, a disease. It's not beneficial to anyone, and people are aware of it. Why still is so prevalent? So, what I'm trying to ask in an indirect way is, this is very addictive, but why this addiction starts? How do we get addicted to it?
You raise a good question, and I think you should one should always be careful not to blame smokers, but rather focus on smoking. Focus on the behavior. There's no personality or a defect that lets some people be smokers and others. What it is the addictive properties of nicotine, which really have been very underestimated. So, in the case of the manufactured cigarette, what Western tobacco industry or cigarette industry has done is very effectively engineer a completely lethal addictive product. And what they do is they've done substantial amounts of research to say, okay, they when they make the cigarette, in the machines, they actually take the nicotine out and then they put it back in and they adjust the pH of it so that it's calibrated to give you a quick hit. That's You're going back to your idea that, why was it cool to smoke as a teenager, as a young adult? Well, hey, it looks good, like I'm eating a Bachchan in a movie, or I'm the Marlboro Man. That's one part. But the other part is that industry manufactured nicotine hit is going to your brain and giving a signal. And the tobacco industry does an incredible amount of research to customize that tweaking to different audiences. I guarantee you that they've researched the Indian smoker and done studies saying what combination of nicotine or the adjustments will most suit the Indian smoker. And that's what they do. Case in point is in the US, it's a little bit of a side, but it's relevant here. In the 60s, smoking became very uncool for cultural reasons among US blacks. So what happened? It was just a cultural pushback. So among black kids and black adults, they just thought, oh, smoking is not cool. And so smoking rates actually fell. So what the tobacco industry did is figure out particular types of menthol flavors that particularly are attractive to the black African American palate. And they started adding menthol and marketing the cigarettes in particular ads to particular communities. So the tobacco industry, which makes about 50 to $100 billion of profit a year. So the way to think about this is they make about $10,000 of profit for each death. You've got 50 billion in profit, 5 million deaths, $10,000 of profit per death. So they have enormous resources to really customize and deliver to different places products. They pair it with extensive advertising and now social media advertising. And this has been one of the key drivers of, if you ask the question, why would people take up something when they think it's obviously, or they know that it's harmful? Well, the other part of it is they also very cleverly tie into people's behavior. And one of the simple ways is they don't say they're targeting adolescents and kids. They say, oh, no, this is an adult choice. But they very well know kids aren't human. And if kids want to be an adult, the best way is to say, okay, I'm going to act like a 24-year-old. And if a cool 24-year-old is smoking, then
And I should be.
I should do as well. They know that. And the advertising and all the promotions have been geared towards really getting kids to take up smoking. Remember, if they lose in India, they would lose about 1 million customers a year. And so they have to replace them. And they replace them because they've died, so they've got to replace them by recruiting new smokers. So the tobacco industry is extremely effective at both designing the micro product, doing all the manipulations around now, particularly social media advertising, And then they are also very effective, unfortunately so, at going to the Ministry of Finance and saying, well, don't tax us too much. They figure out how to manipulate the taxes on cigarettes so they remain affordable. And they then can addict. They basically try to recruit smokers through cheaper, shorter cigarettes. And then they say, okay, now I've got someone addicted. I can try to get them to smoke my more expensive brands on which I get more profit as a tobacco industry. So the industry is absolutely, absolutely ruthless on this, on how they get. So I look at smoking as a product not of individual choice, but biologically mediated addiction paired with an enormous social media and broadly around a marketing influence. The other part of it is it applies less to India, but certainly in most parts of the world. The time that you start to smoke is a time of adolescent rebellion. And 18-year-olds can't imagine being 30 or 40, let alone like the age that your father quit, 50. So they think, all right, that's okay. I'm not going to, I'll get away with it. But they don't. They get addicted and really minimize that manufactured cigarette they're doing is a really intelligently designed machine to addict them. And this is why we have continuing smokers, because of the enormous scientifically led manipulation by the tobacco industry of the product and all the marketing that goes around it.
And you said it becomes very difficult to quit. It seems it's a systematic, honestly, it's a systematic trap to get people to start habituated in something that just does not let you get out. Then what is happening? Why can't we quit? When we start with great passion, we are starting, and forming a habit, in my opinion, is way more difficult than giving up a habit, because we are in the business of fitness. Getting people to stay fit, form a habit of being fit, and the compliance is so difficult that people are upset, they keep quitting. Why that is not the case when it comes to quitting the smoking itself?
Well, there are successes that if you look at how many people have quit smoking, there's some good news around the world. And a simple way to measure this is you just look, let's say, at 50-year-olds and find and ask how many 50-year-olds were former smokers and compare that to how many are current smokers. And the more former to current you have, just that simple ratio, you know that people are quitting to smoke. So now it's the case in Canada, US, UK, much of Europe, that there are more ex-smokers than current smokers because they've quit.
Oh, wow.
But there's surprising places like Brazil that wasn't the case up until about 10, 15 years ago. But what Brazil did, or South Africa did, is they really raised the tax. And then the cigarette became less attractive financially, but it also had an important signal, because what happens in behavioral economics terms is I'm consuming something and I think, okay, I know this is going to be more and more costly because the prices keep going up. So I adjust my behavior. I say, well, okay, I'm not going to smoke, or I'm going to cut down. And those have led to a big increase in cessation in those places, like in South Africa and in Brazil. In India, unfortunately, what's the case is that still there are far more current smokers than former smokers at age 50, and the same in China. Now, what happens is people quit smoking in India as not to avoid disease, but as a consequence of disease. You know, that adage that cancer cured my smoking. Um, and that's unfortunately the phenomenon that's occurring in much of Southeast Asia and East Asia and Russia and others, is Indonesia, Philippines, other these places. Most of the men, and these are predominantly men that smoke in the Asian countries. In Russia, both men and women smoke, but they're quitting as a result of disease, not to avoid disease. And that's a combination of not enough public health action or awareness of the hazards, and also not enough use of taxation as a key instrument. Because taxes, remember, have both the benefit, they deter the price, but they're also an information signal, because they're saying, oh, well, the government is taking the fact that this product is very harmful, and people do use that information. Again, go back to what the tobacco industry does. They very cleverly convince the Minister of Finance in India. They go every year and they say, look, behind closed doors, we know we're the bad guys. We know you have to raise taxes. So, but let's be fair on the smokers. That's what they say. Let's be fair on consumer choice. So whack us a bit with tax. We'll complain and bitch about it, but it's okay. That's manipulation, because what they do is if the government raises the tax a little bit, what the industry does is they'll flood all the, like the Financial Times of India and others, they'll flood all of those with complaints that, oh, this is going to lead to job loss, blah, blah, blah. And very cleverly, they adjust their cigarette supplies so that whatever is taxed, they produce slightly less of, and what is relatively lower tax, they produce more of. And then what they often do is on the premium cigarettes, the longer length, expensive ones, they hike the price even more and they blame the government. So what that does is they pocket the extra revenue. So the Indian taxpayer is losing out because of tobacco industry manipulation. Instead of those extra revenues going to the government, the tobacco industry pockets it with this kind of manipulation. So they do this every year. We've had some efforts with the Ministry of Health to give the counter advice. So we've designed what should taxes look like in India. In some years, we had some success with the Ministry of Finance listen to us. But in the most recent years, certainly for the last 4, taxes haven't risen in India. The price is flat, but as you well know, incomes are going up. So cigarettes are actually more affordable. And then there's actually been a rollback in some of the regulations. It used to be that, in hotels, you could not have any smoking in public places. And now they've done a carve out that, well, you can have a non smoking floor. But the non smoking floor is supposed to be where you can have a separate ventilation system that prevents it from getting into other places. Very few hotels have that, but no one's enforcing that. So there's been, unfortunately, a rollback of these things that work where you do price interventions and you try to really restrict smoking in public places. So that's why smoking is maintained in the population. It should be way down, but it's not.
Yeah. In fact, recently there has been a revamp that's being suggested on tobacco taxation. And I think that might help in a way that the tax rates might get increased. I guess a couple of weeks ago, I read some news about this. So something is happening. But I guess the current taxes are still a lot lower than what WHO recommends.
That's right. WHO recommends about 75%.
75%.
Yeah, and that's based upon the work that I did some years ago with the World Bank on what are the kind of the optimal levels of taxation. But India is still about 55, 57%. Yeah. So it's still low. What that does is just remember, in a growing economy, you still have lots of new smokers being recruited. So I think it is a really important phenomenon. Now, if you come back to your audience at the individual level, you can't tax yourself, right? There's saying, no, you can't. You can say, okay, I'm going to try to be aware of the hazards, try to talk to people, but there are things that can be done. And for example, I think there's good evidence that physicians or healthcare providers, even doing a brief 10-minute intervention on every smoker they see. So now the India's healthcare system isn't organized around that, but if you can just imagine that every time a person sees their doctor, even for something else, they're going for a blood pressure check or something, then if the doctor says, "Oh, you're still smoking, what about quitting?" And they give that advice of how to quit, that would help. What's been shown is the most effective thing is if the government at the state and particularly at the federal levels raise taxes, then that is the most effective intervention to get people to quit. Now, I think having cessation programs also is a key part, where if there were a lot more support for cessation clinics, or let's say down to the village level, we know that there are district control officers for tuberculosis. There's a district malaria officer. what about having someone who's in charge of district tobacco control who
Yeah.
goes around and tries to do education, enforces the laws, sees whether the vendors are adhering to the regulations? Like, I think India's moved to banning single cigarette sales, right?
Yeah.
So they can go and check those and they can issue challans if there's any violations of those. So that's not being done. And that would have an impact at the local level, is just try to get more enforcement of the current laws. So all these things would help because you've got a single little product that's killing 10% of Indians.
Yeah.
We know that is very much avoidable, but it'll take not just individual action, it'll take public action.
Right. True. One of the visuals I still remember from movies. So over the weekends, we go to movies, and one of the greatest moves I have seen by the government is there's this long, really, really bad looking video which talks about the negative impact of tobacco, which shows how it actually created it was the reason for a person to have cancer, and subsequently the person died, and a female is crying, and XYZ. And actually that's been very, very impactful. Now people have seen the outcome, which is death, for example, through the video. Now if there has been an impact like that and that has positively helped some people quit, that's great. But I'm thinking from our conversation and from some of these initiatives at the government level, if I were to understand at my own level, why is it so dangerous to continue smoking? How would we talk about the science of it, what it actually does? One of the things you talked about was possibly the plaque formation, or it going to the kidneys and various other places. Can we go through this in detail as I start smoking? What exactly is happening over a period of time? It is a lot like, I remember when I started having conversation with my dad as I got a job early on, he would tell me that, I'm not going to die today. It's many years later. Who knows about that anyway? It's like not having a term insurance because you're always in denial. You think nothing bad is going to happen to you. So is it possible we go through the risk systematically? What exactly is happening to our body as we keep smoking?
Oh, sure, happy to do so. But I think you hit the key issue directly, which is people tend to discount the future. They think, well, I'm not worried. If you're a 25-year-old, I'm not worried about life when I'm 70 or 60, and um, but and so I can have some fun, or they'll think, okay, I'll be able to quit. So we now there is some truth to that, as I mentioned in the statistics, that we want to encourage the smokers that have started to quit as early as possible. You don't want such a message that, if you started smoking, it's just way too late. That actually is a mistake. And we've done some more recent work that also says, okay, if you quit by age 40, for example, or quit by 30, you get back nearly all of the lost life. We've also asked, well, how quickly do you get that lost life back? And about half of the benefit, the long-term benefit of quitting, occurs very quickly. Within 3 years, you get rid of half of the excess risk. So smoking cessation is not just ridiculously effective, but it's also remarkably quick. So I think people have to try to understand that more. So to come back to what are all the effects of smoking? Well, just to walk through, if the instant you inhale a cigarette, well, the constituents of it, that's not just the tobacco, but it's the formaldehyde, the nitrosamines, a whole bunch of other toxins that are in the cigarette will get into your throat and the mouth. So this is why smoking is one of the most common causes of oral cancer in India. Oral cancer is a very common cancer in India, unlike in other parts of the world. And that's also because there's large amounts of chewing tobacco. So they chew and smoke, and that's what gives you particularly high risk. Then it gets into your esophagus, and so it's a big cause of esophageal cancer. And then down into your lungs. And then into your lungs, then it will be, of course, a big cause of chronic lung disease. It just means that the smoking is damaging all the little air bubbles that you have. And so they eventually, the air bubbles work by being little balloons that they can contract. That's what helps you breathe. But they lose their elastic. They just end up like that. And so that's where you get emphysema and long-term chronic respiratory disease. Or you get, if smoking causes some changes in some cells, then that's the origin of different types of lung cancer. And then finally, as mentioned in the tuberculosis infected populations in particular, it can cause the body's kind of locked away the TB bacillus, the bacteria, safely out of harm's way. But the smoking basically breaks down that, just opens the cupboard. TB or it can spread, and it can infect others. That remember, when because you're smoking, TB becomes active. You're putting others at risk around you. So that's just in the lungs, all those mechanisms. And then once it gets into the bloodstream, everywhere the blood goes, it can have effects. So it can have effects in the heart, in the brain, so causing strokes, down to the kidneys, so it can cause kidney cancers and kidney failure. It gets down into the key vital organs, including, and then after that, it gets into the bladder. So every area basically of the body is affected. And then now there's there's effects in particular groups as well. Thankfully, Indian women don't smoke nearly, they smoke in much less than do men. The smoking prevalence has stayed low. Indian women tend to be just more sensible than Indian men anyway. And so, but in the minority that do smoke, there is effects if they are pregnant, because the smoking will cross over into the placenta and then can have enormous impact on the birth of the newborn, or cause prematurity or low birth weight. So smoking has just complete systemic effects throughout the whole body. It impacts every organ basically is affected by it. And now it comes back saying, okay, well, how reversible is this? As mentioned, the suggestion is that except for persistent lung cancer and persistent damage to the lungs from the loss of elasticity or emphysema, much of those harm is actually reparable. Remember, we've got a body designed by evolution that very much tries to repair itself. And if you remove the toxin, if you remove the insult, then much of the repair is possible. So that's why you see in ex-smokers a big reduction in the excess risk from heart attack and stroke. And even from cancers, except for lung cancer, other cancers really become close to never smoker rates over time, because the body does repair itself. So it's the case that it goes everywhere, but that's not a death sentence if you quit. Quitting will absolutely give you benefits, because much of that damage is reversible. Not all of it. I mean, perhaps not to know the specifics, but perhaps in the case of your father, the damage to the arteries in his legs was so advanced from smoking and others that it wasn't completely reversible. But thankfully, he's hopefully got a good outcome with the stents.
Yeah. And he couldn't be happier. As I asked him today, if we gave you a million rupees, will you go back to smoking? And he now thinks it's actually quite derogatory to even think of smoking. And he thinks he's a much better man. He feels a lot better. He has a lot better self-esteem and respect, so as to what he tells me.
And he's running 6K runs, which is great.
Yeah, he, in fact, again, these are smaller nudges that I keep persuading my parents and family through. So we were in a conversation. So we have this regular ritual of getting on a video call with like a lot of us. So 3 generations come together on a call. And we were discussing with my parents that if you do a 10-kilometer run each in a race that we organize, so we also have a bunch of races that we organize. Then I told my parents that we will take you for darshan of one Jyotirlinga. And and so both of them have agreed to do a 10-kilometer run on 1st of Feb next year, which happens to be in Delhi. So those are ways to nudge them, and now they are training for it. So what you're saying is right. They have different motivation now.
Well, that's great. And I mean, just doing any kind of sport, if you're a non-smoker or you quit smoking, is just way easier. I think people who have taken up athletics seriously do that. I think the dangerous part is that I have seen is you've got educated, capable professionals in the urban areas, particularly men, that think, okay, TK, yeah, I go to the gym a few times a week and I have a bit of drinks, and it's okay. I'll have a cigarette or two or three a week, and they think that's not going to be harmful for me. But the evidence, this is where there's a subtlety in the evidence. There's no safe amount of cigarette smoking at all. And even smoking 5 cigarettes a day or 2 cigarettes a day, at least in the Indian context, seems to substantially increase the risk because of our unique predisposition. And that smoking even small amounts for a long time period is the key thing that people need to remember. It's if you want the real hazards of smoking. For example, if I, let's say we went to the Amazon on a trip together and said, all right, well, for that week we're going to smoke for that week. That wouldn't be really that harmful. But if we said, all right, I'm going to be taking a small amount of cigarettes and I'm going to be doing it over 10 years or 20 years, then that the way the toxicity works is the duration of exposure is way more important than the amount of exposure. So, if you're a smoker of just, let's say, half a pack and you've been smoking for 20 years, that's way worse than being a one pack smoker, but for only 10 years. Because, I mean, the amount of overall tobacco consumed is the same, but you've got the prolonged exposure is what particularly causes the diseases that leads to cancer, leads to chronic lung disease, and these sustained changes in the arteries. So that's the risk of thinking, okay, I'm just going to do a little bit, and I'm exercising and I'm doing other stuff. And there are many urban professionals that say that, okay, I'm running, but I also have some cigarettes, and they don't see that the hazards are far bigger from the cigarette. And you don't offset that by the exercise. You don't offset by drinking less. The smoking is so hazardous that you don't reduce the risk by being fit otherwise.
Yeah, you led the million death study, and during the presentation, as you said, the journalists listened to you carefully, and then later in their break, they were smoking.
Yeah.
It is hard to quit, even though they are in that situation where they are privy to the results of a study as comprehensive. So now, how do we get people to quit? It's important. It's critical that they quit. So what's the process of people to start thinking of quitting?
Well, I mean, it's that Mark Twain quote, right? Oh, quitting smoking is easy. I've done it 1,000 times. What the challenge is, because of our reward system, our brains have this particular reward system called the Gabelin system. And the way it works is nicotine gives you and particularly the way the cigarette industry manufactures the nicotine, it quickly reaches your brain and gives you that, this feels great. And then what happens is that brain signal, after taking some cigarettes, it gives you the pleasure, but then it resets. And the only way to get the pleasure again is to take another cigarette. So now, naturally, we're limited by how many cigarettes you can smoke in a row, because the carbon monoxide in the cigarette means if I just smoked 50 cigarettes in a row, I'd get a massive headache because of the carbon monoxide in it. What this means is that if we understand the addictive properties of the system, then people can try to get, okay, how do you quit? One is understanding that it's an addiction, that it's not just, a moral choice or moral failing in any way. It's not. So, and then saying, okay, what do I need to counter the addiction? there are important things that can be done. And one is the cues, the social cues that occur. So if I'm around other smokers, I'll say, oh, okay, well, Vikas is lighting one, I might as well light one. So this is where bans on smoking in public places are really effective. If you go to a bar and no one else is smoking, you're not likely to smoke. So this is where it has an important impact on getting people to quit smoking. I think the other things that if understanding that, well, most smokers that have quit cold turkey, it's just you do the trade-offs and you think, all right, I've been smoking so long, it's hazardous. I just, like your father did, says, okay, it's time for me to quit. They pick a date and they quit. There are all sorts of really cost-effective aids for that. Some of the apps that are on phones that help people plan when to quit are effective. They've been shown in meta-analyses and in randomized trials of those that they actually do help people to quit. Nicotine replacement therapies can also help. So Nicorette or chewing gum can also help. There's a class of antidepressants like bupironate and Veracline and others that also help. Now that is done with a physician. But what is missing in India and many other settings is basically organized efforts so that when patients see a physician, the physician says, I've got a smoker, I should get them into a cessation program, a brief program or an app-based program, or refer them to someplace. We haven't organized our system to get people to quit smoking, but it would be a very cost-effective thing to do. Some states have done that. Some states have done some pilot efforts, and they show that they actually do work well. So it's a combination. You have individual understanding, making sure that you don't think, okay, this is a moral failing. It's the addictive nature of your brain circuitry, and you can reset that. There are things that will reset that. So it's not just a question of, okay, free will and I'm going to quit and a moral failing. We have to remember that because that's often my friends in tobacco control community don't separate smokers from smoking. And it's not a poor judgment on the smoker. It's really because of you've got an industrial designed device that is supposed to keep you addicted. And it's hard to break that. You're countering, you're basically fighting multi-billion corporations that are designed to try to basically keep you unhealthy. But it is possible, and we're not doing enough of it, but it is possible. And I think, for example, particularly the apps and the tools, and you've seen this as well, just like the apps that give you exercise and, you have a daily exercise routine using your phone. Those are the smoking versions, adaptation versions of those are helpful. They have positive things like you plan a date for quitting, and that's when you stop, and then you reward yourself for the numbers of days that you've quit. Now, relapse occurs very often, and the relapse is driven by the neurologic properties. So, and there's a variety of things. My brother-in-law is a trauma surgeon in Vermont, very accomplished guy, and certainly knows the risks. But he smoked, and he'll tell you he's just addicted. And now he's been trying to do some interventions, including using vaping products and others to break that cycle. So, in some people, the addiction is really, really bad. But in many others, you can do it with this combination of knowing that it's an addictive process and planning against it.
Thank you. Very helpful. I've also seen just an extension of what you said in corporates because I spent a lot of time in corporate, in investment bank in different countries. And one of the things I would see that peers would generally meet on a smoke break. They'll be saying that, okay, hey, let us complete the work for next 1 hour and then we'll go for a quick smoke break and we'll catch up there. So what it looked like, how we go for a snack break, it looked like that's how a smoke break is as well. And then it just becomes part of you. It's your habit. And when you don't do it, it just seems like, hey, now where will you go? Because that was the only break that you're looking for. And then I also saw that if we had some other company that is to go for a coffee break or just to go for a walk, one of the things I did, not that I needed to quit anything because I never smoked, but I saw that When I went for my meetings while walking, it was actually such a break from the routine. So I would do my 2 3 hours of work and then go for a walk, and then I will meet an analyst or someone, for example. Maybe a similar habit could also help. When you start to get busy with some other habit, you might leave this one.
That's right. And this would be, I hope, where the corporate sector of India would actually show some leadership. I mean, there's so much of that sector will personally do yoga or do some meditation efforts, but just taking those, or they enjoy walks. Um, but I think thinking about changing the corporate culture so that you effectively say, all right, let's take a little exercise break and or a little dance break, or you say you go for a walk, or you have coffee or tea, and organizing things around that. But I know what you mean. You think, okay, we're going to step outside, we're away from our desks where you've been indoors. And then if corporations could say, all right, you go out on the deck or outside and they'll have a chai wala or a coffee wala, and we offer that. But they really try to enforce the idea that even though you're outside, um, avoid smoking and encouraging those. And then there's really simple things that have been shown is that particularly on smokers, there's this sense that, well, I need something in my mouth. So what has been done is you put out carrots. You know, you put out carrots and people are saying, okay, I'm chewing on something. But that would need corporate health programs and the awareness to say, okay, we want to try to get our population to smoke less. By the way, there's evidence from meta-analyses that if you look at worker productivity, if you just say, all right, I want people to be at work. If I'm just thinking about the bottom line, I've got uh, 500 really smart engineers, but I want them working efficiently. Then there's good evidence that among smokers, absenteeism rates are higher. They miss more days of work because of illness uh, or of having a worse flu and so forth. So there's a corporate argument that if you want a healthier, more productive workforce, then really decreasing smoking and obesity for that matter would really help the productivity be better. So I hope if there's any of your listeners that are heads of CEOs, they might try to. And then if you come back to peer effects, what's interesting is once you get one CEO or a few exercise, showing this, then others kind of catch on, think, oh, well, we can do that as well. So I'm hoping if you've got any CEO listeners, they take this idea that they want to be leaders in getting their whole population of workers to be particularly healthy and avoid smoking, and then others will catch on. So
Yeah. Or possibly inculcate a fitter habit that will keep them away from smoking for a longer period of time, and that might reduce the chances of their smoking.
yeah, that's right.
So this has been a great conversation, and I hope that through this conversation, a few people quit successfully and many more attempt to quit. This is possibly one of the most insightful conversations I have had to date. It's a public health issue, it's a catastrophe, and it needs to be addressed. And thank you for doing your bit, being here, and for what you've been doing for decades.
Well, thank you. And I have to admit that, as an epidemiologist, I need smokers more than they need me because I get to study the diseases and to understand that. But I think the message as humans is we all value a healthy, productive life where you're free of disease. Eventually you're going to drop dead, but ideally that's in old age when you've lived a good, full life. And losing a decade of good, full life from smoking is very much an avoidable calamity. So I hope your listeners and your audience do take up this idea. I'll add one more thing, which I think you also alluded to, is one of the things that does work is how do you get adults to quit smoking? Well, in fact, children's inputs into those are particularly effective. And there was a nice study that said particularly daughters talking to their fathers is a very effective way of saying quit. And you think, well, look, I want you around to be married, or I want you there for our grandchildren or your grandchildren. So I think if your viewers say if they've got a a parent or a grandparent that smokes. Go and try to talk to them about the benefits of quitting, and hope that has been shown. In fact, there's some randomized evidence that's shown that children's advice to adults, to parents, actually is a pretty effective way of getting them to quit smoking.
Wow, hopefully the kids are listening and they take it as their moral obligation and duty as well to take up to get their parents to quit if at all they're smoking.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time, sir, today.
Thanks very much, Vikas. All the best.
Thank you. That was all for today. I hope you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed speaking with Dr. Jha. It is almost our moral obligation, our duty, to be a promoter of quitting smoking. It's dangerous to you, to me, to all of us today and tomorrow. Let's please do everything that's possible to stop, to reduce the usage, the purchase, the influence of smoking on our lives and make it a fitter one. That is all.